still living in that cramped apartment?" My uncle laughed. Then my cousin's fiancée noticed my watch, Googled it, and his smile dropped. Suddenly, the whole table went quiet. I, 34M, hadn't seen my uncle's side of the family in almost 8 years. Not by accident. After my parents died when I was 19, I learned exactly how much family loyalty was worth when there was money on the table. My father had built a modest real estate business from nothing. 3 small apartment buildings in decent neighborhoods, a commercial property downtown. Nothing spectacular, but enough to live comfortably. When he and my mother died in a car accident during my sophomore year of college, the will was clear. Everything came to me. My uncle, Dad's older brother, had expected something different. He'd always thought he deserved a cut, maybe even control of the business until I was older. The will said otherwise. The lawsuit came within 6 months. My uncle claimed my father had promised him partnership, that I was too young and irresponsible, that the properties should be sold and the money put in trust with him as executor. His lawyer was aggressive. The whole thing dragged on for 18 months and cost me nearly $40,000 in legal fees. I won, but the family fractured. My uncle's wife stopped returning calls. My 3 cousins, who I'd grown up with like siblings, vanished from my life. Holiday cards stopped coming. I sold one of the apartment buildings to cover the legal costs and my remaining college tuition. Kept my head down, finished my degree in finance, and started working 80-hour weeks at a commercial real estate firm. I lived in the same cramped 1-bedroom apartment I'd moved into during the lawsuit because every extra dollar went into buying properties. Foreclosures, mostly. Places that needed work. I learned to do basic repairs myself, hired contractors for the rest, and flipped or rented them out. By 28, I owned 6 properties free and clear. By 32, I had 14 and had started a small property management company. Nothing flashy. I drove a 10-year-old Honda, wore Timex watches, bought my clothes at outlet malls. I'd learned the hard way that showing off just painted a target on your back. The wedding invitation came as a shock. My youngest cousin was getting married. Someone must have tracked down my address because it arrived at my office, forwarded from my old apartment building. There was a handwritten note inside from my aunt saying it would mean a lot if I came. That enough time had passed. That family should be together for important moments. I almost threw it away. Then I thought about my cousin. He'd been 14 when everything went bad. Just a kid. It wasn't his fault his father was a greedy bastard. I RSVP'd yes for the rehearsal dinner and wedding. The rehearsal dinner was at an upscale Italian place downtown. I arrived exactly on time, wearing a suit I'd bought off the rack at Nordstrom Rack 3 years ago for a business meeting. My watch was a different story. I'd bought it 6 months earlier in a moment of weakness after closing a particularly satisfying deal. A Patek Philippe Nautilus. Retail was around $70,000, but I'd found it used from an estate sale for $48,000. Still an insane amount of money for a watch, but I'd wanted something to mark the moment when I'd officially made it. I'd worn it exactly 4 times, all to business meetings where the clients expected a certain image. Tonight, I wore it because some petty part of me wanted proof I'd made something of myself. I'd slipped it on without really thinking about it, then almost changed my mind in the parking lot. But I was already late, so I went in. The private dining room was full of people I barely recognized. My uncle had gained weight and lost most of his hair. My aunt looked older, more tired. My cousins were adults now, practically strangers. The youngest one, the groom, spotted me first and actually smiled. He came over and hugged me, told me he was glad I'd made it. His fiancée was beside him, a pretty woman with sharp eyes and a friendly smile. She shook my hand and said she'd heard so many stories. My uncle appeared behind them. His expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He shook my hand with a grip that lasted a fraction too long, asked how I'd been. I kept my answer vague. Fine. Working a lot. The usual. We moved to the table. I ended up seated between my middle cousin and his girlfriend, directly across from my uncle. The conversation flowed around me while I focused on my water glass and the menu. Someone asked what I was doing for work these days. I said I was in property management. My uncle perked up at that, asked if I was still holding on to my father's buildings. I told him I'd sold one years ago, kept the other 2. He nodded slowly, and I could see him doing the math, probably assuming I was scraping by as a landlord. He launched into a speech about his own success. He'd gone into pharmaceutical sales after the lawsuit, done very well for himself. Made 6 figures easy. His oldest son was in medical school. The middle one was an engineer at a tech company. The youngest was marrying a lawyer. He didn't say it directly, but the implication hung there. They'd all done fine without my father's money. I nodded along and sipped my water. Someone asked where I was living these days. I said I'd been in the same apartment for years, which was technically true even though I'd moved out 2 years ago. My uncle actually laughed. He said something about how some people never learn to let go of the past, still living like broke college kids when they should be building real lives. I felt the old anger flicker but kept my face neutral. I was about to respond when the groom's fiancée leaned forward slightly. She was looking at my wrist where my hand rested near my wine glass. Her eyes had gone wide. She asked if she could see my watch. The question came out casual, but there was an edge to it. I hesitated, then extended my arm slightly. She leaned in closer, and I saw her eyes scanning the face, the complications, the subtle details. Then she pulled out her phone. The table kept talking around us. My uncle was telling some story about a vacation property he'd looked at in Florida. His wife was discussing the wedding flowers. But the fiancée had gone silent, her fingers moving rapidly across her phone screen. I watched her pull up what looked like a watch forum, then an auction site, then another page. Her expression shifted from curiosity to shock to something like disbelief. She looked up at me, then at the watch, then at her phone again. The groom asked her what she was doing. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her phone screen toward him. He looked, frowned, looked at my wrist, then back at the phone. His eyebrows went up. My uncle had stopped talking mid-sentence. The whole table had gone quiet. My aunt asked what was going on. The fiancée cleared her throat and said she'd just been curious about the watch because it looked expensive. She showed the phone to the groom again and said something quietly. He whistled low. My middle cousin asked what kind of watch it was. I kept my voice even and said it was a Patek Philippe. My uncle's expression shifted. He asked what model, like he knew anything about watches. I told him it was a Nautilus. The fiancée was still staring at her phone. She mentioned, almost to herself, that the current market value on these was over $100,000. The silence that followed was absolute. My uncle's face went from confusion to calculation to something uglier. He asked if it was real. I felt the anger fully now, but kept my voice calm. I told him it was real. I'd bought it from an estate sale. He sat back in his chair. His expression had gone hard. He asked how someone in property management could afford a six-figure watch. The implication was clear. He thought I'd somehow cheated, stolen, or worse. I'd spent 8 years keeping quiet, building in silence, letting them all assume I'd struggled or failed or just barely survived. Something in me snapped. I told him property management could be very lucrative if you managed your own properties. He asked how many properties I was managing. I said around 60 doors across 14 buildings. His face went blank. His wife looked confused. My middle cousin asked if I meant I owned 14 buildings. I confirmed I did. Free and clear. No mortgages. I'd spent the last 8 years buying, renovating, and renting. The portfolio was worth roughly $12 million at current market rates. My property management company also handled third-party clients now, which added another revenue stream. I cleared about $600,000 annually after expenses and taxes. The table was completely silent. My uncle looked like he'd been punched. His carefully constructed narrative about his successful sales career and my presumed failure had just detonated in his face. The oldest cousin asked why I still lived in the same apartment. I explained I'd actually moved 2 years ago to a house in the suburbs. A modest place, 3 bedrooms, nothing flashy. But when they'd asked earlier, I'd mentioned the apartment because it was easier than explaining everything. My aunt asked why I'd never told anyone. I looked directly at my uncle. I said that after spending 18 months and $40,000 defending myself against a lawsuit that tried to take everything my parents left me, I decided privacy was valuable. I'd learned that showing success just made you a target. So I kept my head down and worked. My uncle's face had gone red. He started to say something about how the lawsuit was just him trying to protect the family assets, make sure I didn't squander everything. I cut him off. I told him he'd tried to take my inheritance because he thought he deserved it more than I did. He'd called me irresponsible and immature in court documents. He'd dragged my parents' memory through depositions and legal briefs. And when he lost, he'd cut me off completely. The groom looked uncomfortable. His fiancée was watching everything with wide eyes. My middle cousin was staring at his plate. The oldest looked angry, but I couldn't tell at whom. I stood up. I told my youngest cousin I was happy for him, and his fiancée seemed wonderful. I said I'd attend the wedding tomorrow because I'd promised I would, but after that, I thought it was better if we all went back to our separate lives. I'd made my peace with not having this family years ago. My uncle stood too. He said I was being dramatic, that he'd done what he thought was right at the time, that I needed to let go of old grudges. His voice had that same condescending tone from the lawsuit, like I was still a stupid kid who didn't understand how the world worked. I told him I had let go. That's why I'd built a successful life without any of them. I didn't need his approval or his presence. I'd come tonight as a courtesy to my cousin, but I was done pretending we were family. My aunt started crying. The groom stood and asked me to stay, said we could talk through this. I appreciated the sentiment, but I was already heading for the door. Behind me, I heard my uncle shouting something about disrespect and arrogance. I didn't turn around. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before driving home. Part of me felt vindicated. The look on my uncle's face had been worth 8 years of silence. But mostly I just felt tired. Update 1. The wedding was the next afternoon. I almost didn't go, but I'd made a promise to my cousin and I kept my promises. I arrived just before the ceremony started and sat in the back row on the groom's side. The ceremony was nice. Traditional. The bride looked beautiful, and my cousin looked happy. I slipped out during the receiving line and went to the reception venue early. The reception was at a hotel ballroom downtown. I found my assigned seat at a table with some of the groom's college friends, far from the family tables. Perfect. The meal service started, and I made small talk with the people around me about harmless topics. Work, weather, how they knew the groom. I was halfway through my entree when my oldest cousin appeared beside me. He asked if we could talk outside. I followed him to a quiet hallway near the bathrooms. He looked uncomfortable, kept running his hand through his hair. He told me he'd spent the whole night thinking about what I'd said at the dinner. He said he'd been 20 when the lawsuit happened. He believed his father's version of events because that's what you do when you're 20 and your dad tells you something. But last night had made him think. He'd gone home and actually read through some of the legal documents his father had kept in a file box in the office. Stuff about the will, the depositions, the claims about my supposed irresponsibility. He said he'd never realized how vicious it had been. His father had painted me as a reckless kid who'd blow through the inheritance in a year. Had claimed my father must have been pressured or coerced into cutting his brother out. Had tried to argue I was mentally unstable from grief. None of it was true. He said he felt sick reading it. I didn't know what to say. I'd spent 8 years angry at all of them. But looking at my cousin now, I realized he'd been just as much a victim of my uncle's manipulation as I had been. He asked if there was any way to fix this, to have some kind of relationship. I told him I honestly didn't know. The trust was gone, but I appreciated him looking into it and making his own judgment. He nodded and said he understood. Then he asked if I'd at least stay for the whole reception. His brother was getting married, and regardless of everything else, he'd want me there. I agreed. We went back inside. The dancing had started, and I spent the next few hours making awkward small talk and avoiding my uncle. My aunt approached me once, tried to apologize for everything. I told her I appreciated the sentiment, but apologies didn't undo 8 years of silence. She looked hurt, but nodded and walked away. Around 9, the groom found me near the bar. He pulled me aside and thanked me for coming. He said his fiancée had been mortified about the whole watch thing, thought she'd caused a huge family incident. I told him it wasn't her fault. The incident had been brewing for 8 years. She'd just been the catalyst. He said he'd been too young to really understand what happened back then, but he'd always wondered why I never came around anymore. His parents had told him I'd chosen to distance myself, that I was bitter about business stuff. He'd believe them because why wouldn't he? But after last night, he'd asked his father directly what the lawsuit had been about. My uncle had given him some vague answer about protecting family interests. It hadn't matched what my oldest cousin had said after reading the documents. I told him the truth then. The whole story. How his father had sued to take my inheritance. How he'd lost. How the family had cut me off afterward. My cousin listened with an expression that shifted from shock to anger to sadness. When I finished, he said he wished he'd known sooner. I told him some things kids were better off not knowing. He said he wasn't a kid anymore. Fair point. He asked if I'd be willing to have coffee sometime. Just the two of us. Get to know each other again as adults. I said maybe. He seemed satisfied with that. The reception ended around 11. I congratulated the happy couple one more time and headed out. In the parking lot, I ran into my middle cousin. He was smoking a cigarette by his car, which surprised me because he'd been a health nut as a teenager. He saw me and offered a half-hearted wave. He said he owed me an apology. He'd been 17 during the lawsuit, old enough to know better, and he'd just gone along with his parents' version of events because it was easier. He'd watched them cut me off and hadn't questioned it. He'd seen the photos of their vacations and new cars and his medical school tuition getting paid, and he'd never once wondered if maybe that money should have gone somewhere else. I asked what he meant. He said after I left the rehearsal dinner, he'd done some math. His father's pharmaceutical sales job was good, but not that good. Not good enough to send a kid to private medical school, buy a vacation home in Florida, and retire early at 58 like his father was planning. He'd asked his mother where the money had come from. She'd gotten defensive, said they'd saved wisely and made good investments. But he'd pressed, and eventually, she'd admitted that my uncle had gotten a large settlement from his employer 2 years after the lawsuit. Something about improper commission structures. Nearly $2 million. They'd invested it, lived off the returns, and used it to fund their lifestyle. My cousin said he'd never connected the dots before. His father had tried to take my inheritance through court, failed, then lucked into money another way, and never once considered reaching out to apologize or reconcile. I told him I appreciated him telling me, but it didn't really change anything. My cousin nodded. He said he understood. Then he asked if I'd hated them all these years. I thought about it. I told him I'd been angry, sure, but mostly I just moved on, built my own life, stopped waiting for an apology that was never going to come. He said that seemed lonely. I told him it was, sometimes, but it was also peaceful. I'd learned to rely on myself, to trust my own judgment, to not need validation from people who'd already shown me who they were. He finished his cigarette and said he hoped maybe we could talk again sometime. I said maybe. I drove home and sat in my driveway for a while before going inside. My house was dark and quiet. I'd bought it with cash 2 years ago. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a small yard. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. No mortgage, no co-signers, no family drama attached to it. I thought about my uncle's face when he realized I'd succeeded. The shock and anger, and something like fear. He'd spent 8 years thinking he'd won, that I'd struggled while his family thrived. Finding out the opposite was true had shattered something in him. Part of me felt guilty for enjoying that moment, but a larger part felt vindicated. I hadn't sued him back or sought revenge or tried to sabotage his life. I'd just worked hard, built something real, and let him stew in his assumptions. Sometimes the best revenge was just succeeding quietly while everyone who doubted you convinced themselves you'd failed. Update 2. 3 weeks after the wedding, my oldest cousin called me. He asked if I'd be willing to meet for lunch. I was hesitant, but something in his voice made me agree. We met at a diner halfway between our houses. He looked tired. He told me he'd confronted his father about the lawsuit documents. My uncle had gotten defensive, said the documents were taken out of context, that he'd been trying to protect me from myself. My cousin hadn't bought it. He'd asked his father directly why he'd never apologized or tried to reconcile. My uncle had said I was the one who'd cut them off, that the door had always been open. My cousin had called him out on the lie. He'd pointed out that I'd never received a single call, letter, or message after the lawsuit ended, that every attempt at contact had been one-sided. My uncle had gotten angry, told him he was being disrespectful, and stormed out. They hadn't spoken since. I told my cousin I was sorry he was caught in the middle. He said he wasn't in the middle anymore. He'd chosen a side. He wanted to try to build some kind of relationship with me if I was open to it. He understood if I wasn't, but he felt like he'd lost 8 years with a cousin he'd looked up to as a kid, and he didn't want to lose more time. I thought about it. The anger I'd carried had dulled over the years into something more like indifference. But sitting across from my cousin, seeing genuine remorse and effort, I realized maybe I didn't have to cut off everyone just because their father was a bastard. We agreed to try. Slowly. No pressure. Just occasional lunches and seeing where it went. My middle cousin reached out a week later with a similar request. Then, surprisingly, the youngest cousin and his new wife invited me to dinner at their apartment. Over takeout Chinese food, they told me they wanted to build their own family traditions, separate from the drama of previous generations. They wanted me included if I was willing. I was. Slowly, carefully, I started building relationships with my cousins again. Not as the family we'd been before, but as adults who could choose to connect on our own terms. My uncle never reached out. Neither did my aunt, after that one attempt at the wedding. I was fine with that. My business kept growing. I bought 3 more properties that year. Started mentoring a few younger investors who were trying to break into real estate. I dated a woman I met at a property management conference for about 6 months before we mutually agreed we were better as friends. Life moved forward. About a year after the wedding, my oldest cousin called with news. His father had lost most of that settlement money in a bad investment scheme. Some kind of cryptocurrency scam that promised guaranteed returns. My uncle was broke, facing potential bankruptcy, and had asked his kids for money. All 3 had said no. My cousin asked if I felt vindicated. I told him I mostly felt sad. My uncle had spent so much energy trying to take what wasn't his, then lucking into money he hadn't earned, and now he'd lost it all chasing easy returns. He'd destroyed his relationship with his brother's son and damaged his relationships with his own kids. And for what? He had nothing to show for any of it. My cousin said their mother was divorcing him. Apparently, losing the money had revealed other problems in the marriage that she'd been ignoring. She'd already moved in with her sister and hired a lawyer. My uncle was living alone in their house, trying to figure out how to pay the mortgage on his sales pension. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant. The man who tried to take everything from me had lost everything himself. But mostly I just felt empty. Revenge, even passive revenge, didn't feel as satisfying as I'd imagined it would. My youngest cousin asked if I'd consider helping his father. Not with money, but maybe with advice. My uncle didn't know anything about real estate investment or building wealth slowly and steadily. He'd always looked for shortcuts. Maybe I could teach him something. I thought about it for a long time. The old me, the angry 19-year-old who'd spent $40,000 fighting off a lawsuit, wanted to tell him to go to hell. But I wasn't that kid anymore. I'd built something real. I had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life if I never worked another day. I had relationships with my cousins that were slowly healing. I had nothing left to prove. I told my cousin I'd think about it. A week later, I sent my uncle an email. Short. Simple. I told him I'd heard about his situation. I wasn't interested in giving him money or rebuilding a relationship. But if he wanted advice on legitimate ways to rebuild his finances through real estate investment, I'd be willing to talk. Once. What he did with that information was up to him. He never responded. My oldest cousin told me later that my uncle had been too proud to accept help from me, that he'd rather struggle than admit he'd been wrong about everything. I wasn't surprised.